Hello everyone, it's me, that embroidery girl, back with another embroidery tutorial, and this time is something a little bit different. I've done some fan art from one of my personal favourite characters growing up. I've also decided to use woven picots to see just how far I can push the stitch. I've kept it super simple, just a simple woven picot, some satin stitch and some French knots. Let me show you how I did it. So first things first, I'm going to start by transferring over my design with a water soluble pen like so. You're going to need some pins, just any short dressmaking pins are fine, and I'm going to begin to pin around this drawing. I'm going to leave a little bit of a seam allowance on the outside and just above the drawing. You'll see I'll alter these pins a little bit here and there just to make sure that I'm going to get a nice even weave. I'm going to want as many pins in here as possible so I've got some really nice anchoring points. But nothing too technical really, and you'll see that as I go along. Fiddling around with pins is kind of boring, so I'm going to speed this up and yeah, just pay close attention to where I put these pins. That's pretty much perfect. So today I'm going to be using this thick perle thread and a long darner's needle. So the anchoring point for this entire woven picot is the chin area. So I'm going to take this thread and I'm going to go under the very end of the first pin, around all of these pin tops like so, and then around the underneath of the outermost pin and then back down through the chin. Now everything needs to come up through the chin area, so we're going to try and make sure that that's not too dense. And I've got around 2 meters of perle thread on my needle, so a huge amount. And I'm going to create that chin and cheek idea again by going underneath the second innermost pin here, the very end, and then round the top. So I've got this triangle shape, and then I'm going to repeat that shape again on the other side. So I'm going to come underneath the bottom of that pin, like so, round the top of that second innermost pin, and then back down. I'm going to come up and make a third triangle, and this is going to go underneath all of these middle pins and back down, and then a fourth triangle underneath just 3 of these pins and then back down. And then I'm just going to have one line come up again all through the chin area around this very center pin, and then I'm going to put a buttonhole stitch through all of these threads and tighten it on this side, and then I'm going to repeat that process on the other side. And this is just going to make sure when my pins come out, this is nice and kept together. We're already going to be having a little bit of a fray at the bottom. We're going to have to stitch in. We really don't want that same thing at the top. So now we're going to begin our weave. So I'm going to go underneath this central line here, over the top of all of these threads. Now I'm under, I'm going to make sure I'm over the top of the center, and then I'm going to go under all of these ones, and you'll see that I'm working in between these first 3 pins at first. So like I said, the weave combination is under, over, and I'm going to work between these 3 pins until I can't fill it up anymore. So I'm going to carry on with this weaving sequence in between these first 3 pins. And then once I've done that, I'm going to come out through the next set of pins, but I'm going to put a buttonhole stitch here. At this point, every single time I go on the outside of one of these pins, just a little loop stitch, just to make sure that it's really nice and tight and I can avoid that gap. So you'll see it hasn't happened on the opposite side yet. I'm going to keep weaving, and then at this point, another little loop stitch goes in. So I've just created a loop, I've gone back through that loop, and I'm just going to pull that nice and tight upwards against the other pins and the weave, and then I'm going to carry on weaving. And I'm gonna continue doing this, so I'll be packing in between every single pin really tightly with my weave. And then once I've filled up that area, I will put a little buttonhole stitch tight next to all of the rest of the weave, and then I'll carry on weaving through the next set of pins until I can start to weave in a straight line. So I'm almost at the point where I can start to go in a straight line, and you'll notice that as I'm getting further down, it's increasingly harder for the thread to sort of just sit straight against the top weave. So I'm just knocking it into place with either my finger or the needle, just like this, just to hold it all together. We want to pack this really, really nice and tight, so this will use a huge amount of thread, but you need it to be really dense. So again, the whole sequence is under, over, and you'll be able to see if you've woven correctly, because it should look almost like corn on the cob. In fact, this stitch is called corn on the cob when it's used in its normal capacity with just 3 strands. So as I get further down the head, one of the problems that I am encountering is keeping the anchoring points underneath the pins. So those parts that made the jawline, that really nice little shape at the bottom, they're not staying underneath the pins. My pins aren't quite long enough. So what I'm going to do is place a couple of stitches over the top of this thread, like so, with just a needle and some cotton, a couple of times in all of the key areas, just to make sure that if the pins move, the actual anchoring points don't. Now it's really important to understand that I'm stitching over the top of this thread. I'm not stitching at all through it. I'm stitching over the top nice and tight so that it stays in place. And I'm actually going to add another anchoring point for a cheek, like a jawline here. So I'm just going to pull this thread out slightly too, and that's just going to mean that my weave is a little bit more even. And I'm going to repeat that on the other side, and then I'm going to again put a couple of stitches just to make sure that it's nice and tight. And then I'm going to stitch these 2 anchoring points too. Now the thread, what should happen is when I take my pins out, which I'll show you later on, the thread should just simply be cut away, and that's fine, there's no problems. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. I think that'll make a nice weave. So I'm going to carry on weaving, and you'll notice that I'm coming to the end of my thread right now. So what I'm going to do is get a new piece and do a reef knot. So I'm going to go under with one side of the thread and then over the top with the other side of thread to make a reef knot that won't come out. I'm going to pull that really, really super tight to make the knot as small as possible. Put a lot of pressure to make sure it won't come undone, and then snip the 2 sides off as close as possible to the knot so that it is super unnoticeable once I begin weaving again. So I'm going to carry on with my under over picot stitch, and you'll notice I'm coming more and more to the very end of my shape. So there is less and less space to be able to get the needle through. So we're going to have to start doing some tips and tricks just to make sure that this shape comes in. And the first tip is buttonhole stitch. So as you come down to any point, any kind of sharp point like here in the jaw, you're going to have to put a buttonhole stitch on the very edge. So you can see I've gone over the top, and then I'm just going to go back through that loop just to make sure that I have a buttonhole stitch. And then I'm going to carry on weaving, and I'm going to do the same on the other side. Now what this buttonhole stitch does is it secures the thread at an angle. So I'm going to need to do this same stitch, the buttonhole stitch, throughout the whole length of this jaw. So any of these sloping type of threads, anything that's sloping on the weave, I'm going to need to put buttonhole stitches in just to make sure that it stays. Now I don't have to put a buttonhole stitch in the inside of the weave, it's just on this very outside here, and you'll see this stitch constantly every single time or every other time that I come through on this sort of sloping down jawline part. I'm weaving and then I'm going ahead and putting an anchoring buttonhole stitch on the edge. And I'm going to do that until I've filled up the space, or I feel like the thread is so densely packed that I no longer need a buttonhole stitch. So as you slowly begin to fill in this shape, doing all of your buttonhole stitches, you'll see that the weave becomes harder and harder to sort of fill in. So just do what you can, grab any area that you can, and then once you've finished, just bring the needle down through where the chin area is, and then remove your pins and also your tacking stitches very carefully. Don't pull the thread up too much, otherwise you will end up with gaps and holes. Be careful of the fabric as well, you don't want to cut holes in that either. And then just release some of the tension, make sure that it's nice and even, and it should look like this. So next I've got some felt, and I'm just going to pad this area lightly. So I've put a tacking stitch down, and then I'm going to do an overcast stitch with a needle and thread all the way around the outside. Now what I did to get the shape of the head is I actually drew around a piece of paper the actual head shape. So I put a piece of paper underneath this woven picot, drew around it, and then I cut that shape out, making it around about 5mm to 6mm smaller, and then trimmed it into shape. So trimmed it even more if I needed to, and I found I needed to particularly around the chin area just to make sure that this felt fitted. Now you can see as I'm stitching this felt, I am making sure that I'm stitching the felt only. I am not stitching the woven picot whatsoever. So as you can see, lots of stitches go into this just to make sure that this is really firmly stitched down. And then once I'm happy, I'm just going to place the woven picot over the top and make sure it fits. And yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to begin to stitch the woven picot down, making sure that it covers the felt shape entirely. So I'm just going to fast forward through most of this, but you'll see that all I'm doing is taking a single strand of thread. So this is not an embroidery floss, this is actually just a thread. I'm keeping my stitches really small, and that way using a white thread will be unnoticeable. And I'm just going to stitch around the whole edge of this shape, lots of small dense overcast stitches just to bring that shape close to the felt padding underneath and make sure that this looks like Pikachu's head. So once I'm happy with that shape, I'm just going to need to add in the details of Pikachu. So I'm going to need to draw on his eyes again with a water-soluble pen, add a little nose, and of course give him that famous mouth, which is more or less like just two sloping sort of shapes. And once I'm happy with the eyes, the nose and the mouth, I'm going to add some cheeks, and I'm doing this in a water soluble pen, so any mistakes I can just kind of spritz and then adjust, but I'm pretty happy with what I've done so far. This looks pretty much like Pikachu to me. So next I'm going to take a double strand of black thread. This isn't even embroidery floss, this is actually thread. So it's just a strand that I've knotted at the very end, and I kind of like using this more than the embroidery floss. It's a bit more slippery and it doesn't cause as many knots. And all I'm going to do is outline my eyes, nose, mouth and cheeks in this thread basically. I'm going to keep these stitches nice and small and as straight as possible, but when they're kept small, straight stitches can form curves, so that's all I'm going to do. Keep these stitches really nice and small, and you'll see as I progress on, I'll outline the entirety of Pikachu's face. And once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and take some brown embroidery floss. This is doubled over with a knot at the end, and begin to fill in the eyes with the same straight stitch. And once I've done that, I'm going to go ahead and fill in with the black, and then the little eye dots in white, and then of course he wouldn't be Pikachu without these red cheeks. So next I have to add some ears in. So you might be able to see just the faint outline of template for ears in some water soluble pen. So I'm just going to outline those now in a woven picot. This is just going to be a super simple 3-stranded woven picot made in exactly the same way that any other bog standard woven picot is, but I am going to add a buttonhole stitch just at the top here that you can see me doing, just so that I can reinforce it. I like to make like a little point in the ears, and sometimes that gets lost when you're doing a wider 3 woven picot strand. And again, I'm just weaving under over, and as I get further along down the ears, I'm actually going to adjust the pins so they are slightly further down and slightly more sprayed out, just so that I can get a little bit of a wider ear now. And then I'm going to carry on weaving. So once I've got to the point where the pins are, I'm going to put a buttonhole stitch in either side, just to make sure that this is nice and secure and I can get that little point that I want in. And then I'm going to carry on weaving and just bring the thread through the fabric to finish off and remove the pins. And then I'm going to need to do that to the opposite side, in exactly the same way. So carry on weaving, and as you get further down, move the pins, add those little buttonhole stitches, and then finish off weaving, and you're pretty much done. So next I need to add the black bits to the ear. So I've just stitched in a straight line straight across the ear, and I've started to add some French knots, but I decided I was actually going to add them and attach them to the fabric. Originally I was just going to leave them plain, but I think it looks quite cute actually to bring the woven picot forward and just stitch it down so it's got that little bend that you can see, and add some French knots to hold it all in place. So I'm going to go ahead and fill in this area, and then I'll talk to you after. So I'm on the second ear now, and all I'm doing is placing a straight stitch through the picot just to mark out where I want this black line to be. I'm just going to do it carefully, try not to disturb the weave in the ear too much. And then once I'm happy, I'm going to stitch this down. I'm actually going to again raise the ear a little bit, so we've got a little bit of sort of like a 3D element in there. And then I'm just going to go ahead and again fill this area in with French knots. And of course, once you've finished filling in this second ear, you are done. So that's it, that's the full tutorial. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think? How did I do? And more importantly, what character do you want to see next? Don't forget to tag me on Instagram if you decide to do this tutorial and you post the photo. I will of course put it in my stories and even on my feed when I get to 1,000 subscribers over on this platform YouTube. I am going to be doing a very, very special giveaway, but until then, please do like, comment and subscribe. It's helping me grow so much, and if you want to see more, you know what to do. See you next time.